So today we're going to be talking about the canon tiers, but the caveat to that is we cannot explain the canon tier system without explaining how they applied to the Holocron and raising some important points. Let's get going. For a basic explanation, a lot of people watching this, I would assume, are familiar with the designations of the canon tier list, at least, if not the descriptions. But I'm going to go over them anyway. So officially, as of 2014, when the sidelining of the expanded universe occurred, yes, it's technically not decanonized, because they never said that. They just put it on the side and started a new timeline. We have G-Canon, T-Canon, C-Canon, S-Canon, D-Canon, and N-Canon. That seems too many. Earlier on, it was G-Canon, C-Canon, S-Canon, and N-Canon, which is simpler. But let me get into the descriptions of it, because I think that's necessary to understand the context and what we're talking about here. Now, these are the official descriptions from Lucasfilm. So G-Canon, right up the top, is the George Lucas canon. The 6 episodes, the episodic movies, and any statements by George Lucas, including unpublished production notes from him and his production department, that are never seen by the public. Elements originating with Lucas that are included in movie novelizations, reference books, and other sources are also G-Canon. Although, anything created by the authors of these sources that are not direct from George Lucas would be considered C-Canon. When the films were changed and newest editions were deemed to take canonical precedence over older ones, officially, so Han wasn't the only one who shot. He did a funny head move. Expressed George Lucas's vision more closely, basically. That's why they do that. The deleted scenes included on the DVDs were also considered G-Canon, where they don't conflict with the movie. Now, T-Canon, or television canon, basically it's only the Clone Wars of what's publicly released anyway. It was going to be for the unfinished live action TV show that then was unfortunately cancelled, called Underworld, and was intended to include any other television series going forwards. This, though, included the feature film for the Star Wars The Clone Wars. That's a 2008 3D CGI animated series. However, it does not include the 2003 micro series by Genndy Tartakovsky. T-Canon was added that bit later when the Clone Wars started to be in production. However exactly that came about, I'm not going to speak to it because I don't know the ins and outs of what happened. And next is the biggest one as far as how much is in it. C-Canon is called continuity canon. This consists of all recent works basically since 1991, when Heir to the Empire came out, that would begin to actually start to pay a bit more attention to continuity in the Star Wars universe. This includes books, games, comics, cartoons, non-theatrical films. So those would be the Holiday Special and the 2 Ewoks movies, Caravan of Courage and Battle for Endor. The caveat on the games is like, it explicitly states, I'm checking the Wikipedia things as well as adding in my own knowledge of it, but centering myself because I've rethought these things through the years and didn't want to say my own interpretation rather than the official interpretation. Stats and gameplay may not be canon to C-Canon. And there's also non-canon endings for video games that are choice-based. Next is S-Canon, secondary canon. Now, these materials are available to be used or ignored as needed by authors, like they're pieces of information that could be carried on with or not. These largely consist of older works, including the original Marvel Star Wars comics from issue 0, no, they wouldn't have had an issue 0, issue 1 to issue 107, plus they had Droids and Ewoks, and then Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi were not inside the numbered series for some reason, but New Hope was. No, the original Star Wars. They predated an effort to maintain continuity. That is that 1991 date where Heir to the Empire sparked off a lot of the interest in a more concerted effort to actually make a whole timeline. So D-Canon exists because that was going to be for Star Wars Detours, another cancelled show that was meant to be a parody, it's meant to be a comedy show, and is not meant to be seriously part of the timeline. Which is where I think it should fall under N-Canon anyway. N-Canon already exists for non-canon. Yes, they have a canon tier specifically for stuff that is not canon, which is then labelled as Infinities because it was officially licensed non-canon material compared to someone writing fan fiction. So these are what-if stories, or anything irreconcilably contradicted by higher canon ends up here. This is the... That's kind of weird. N was the only level that was not considered canon by Lucasfilm, right? On the walk here, but then there's Detours canon. So this is information cut from canon, deleted scenes, and cancelled Star Wars works. Unless another canonical work referenced it and it was declared canon. However, I think that description of saying Star Wars works is inaccurate to how it applies to the Holocron. We'll get into that, because Wikipedia is edited by fans and made by fans and not by Lucasfilm, so this is just them trying to interpret however they do it. And I think a lot of fans, after explaining that, a lot of fans have a misinterpretation of what they are. So, let's get into the meat of what I want to talk about today. So, these canon tiers were designed to apply to the Star Wars Holocron. What is the Holocron? Because I think people have heard of it and have their own maybe interpretation of it. I know before I checked links and was researching this to make sure I got information right, I think I had a mixed up view of what the Holocron is. And what is a Holocron? The Holocron is an internal database maintained by Lucas Licensing that tracks all the fictional elements created for the Star Wars universe. The database includes material from the films, books, comics, video games, trading cards, role-playing games, websites, toys, cartoons, and just about every officially sanctioned fictional element of the Star Wars universe. Notice they don't say the Holocron includes the films, books, comics, video games, trading cards, role-playing games, websites, toys, cartoons, and just about every officially sanctioned Star Wars work. It says all of the fictional elements from. On the old StarWars.com there was a databank organising entries between characters, creatures, droids, locations, organizations, species, starships, technology, and vehicles. So we have an entry on the Acklay here, and there's a profile saying homeworld, size, diet, what era they came from, what movies they appeared in, all of that. And saying there's particularly information from the expanded universe and from the movies. This is the closest approximation that I can find to be able to say, I think this is what the Holocron was. Listed like this. Not what a lot of people think of that is listed like, oh yeah, it's this book, this novel, this game, either all of it or nothing is canon as far as the story goes. So let's see what led me to get to that. What is a holocron? Are the entries sorted as canonical and non-canonical? Are there various degrees of officialness? This is going to re-explain some parts that I said about the canon tiers, but this is directly from Tasty Taste, which was Leland Cheese foreign name on the oldsouls.com website. These are all links I got from the Wikipedia resources section, by the way. The database does indeed have a canon field for each individual entry and for sources. So they work by individual entries like this data bank here, for the most part, but then they also had a canon field for sources. Though the canon level of the entry would override the canon level of the source, since it factors in other sources associated with that entry. This is the case where a good example is Shira Bree or Lumia. She first appeared in the old Marvel comics. She also carried on, and I know for sure that she's in Legacy of the Force series. Being in Legacy of the Force references Lumia and makes the character C-Canon, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the source, it will not override the canon level of the source, so it wouldn't change that the Marvel comics are S-Canon. So they had two, you could say they had two different levels. They had the source level and the individual entry level. I'll go back here. And then they're both static. The source stays at the same canon level, but then the entry level can change and fluctuate what level of canon it's on, depending on a reference. That doesn't necessarily mean that the events as told in an S-Canon entry are all exactly C-Canon. When determining canon levels for individual entries, anything in the films and from George Lucas, including unpublished internal notes that we might receive from him or from the film production department, is considered G-Canon. Next we have what we call continuity C-Canon, which is pretty much everything else from the EU. There is a secondary S continuity classification used for older published materials created when there was less attention to making everything in the EU fit with everything else in the EU. But if it is referencing something else, it becomes C. That meaning the individual entry, of course. Similarly, any C-Canon entry that makes it into the films can become G-Canon. Lastly, there is a non-canon continuity N, which we rarely use except in the case of a blatant contradiction. Any contradictions that arise are dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So this seems to predate more of the use of the infinities label. It includes unpublished internal notes they might receive and film production, and from the film production department and that, and it's like, these are just indicators of where it comes from. But then also, this says, let's say you come across two or more contradictory sources when chasing down a reference. How do you decide which one to accept as canon? Everything is looked at on a case-by-case basis. Among the factors we consider is in how many sources does this particular fact appear? Yeah, so it's absolutely everything. Which source has the largest audience? What explanation is the coolest? Have we been told by George Lucas to avoid this topic? If, after weighing all those variables, the answer isn't yet clear, the issue is presented to an internal group that makes a final determination as to which source is correct. This, right here, tells you that the canon tiers are indicators. They are not rules. They just mean to indicate where something is from in the holocron. And it's a good segue into the next question saying, are deleted scenes considered G-level? Yes, unless they conflict with something else seen in the films or if the reasoning behind deleting the scene keeps it from being continuity. Addendum, this applies only to deleted scenes publicly released. So it's deleted scenes we don't even see. A great example of a deleted scene not counting towards continuity is the death of Shark T in Revenge of the Sith. Everything goes by case-by-case basis. That deleted scene is publicly released, so this would keep it in continuity. There must have been another reason it keeps it from continuity. Obviously it wasn't in the movie novelization, and so that deleted scene doesn't count. Amongst all of the deleted scenes and possible deaths that she may have died multiple times, the only one that counts is The Force Unleashed. Here's an interesting point. Sorry, I really wouldn't take too much stock into the difference between G level and C level, because the lines between the two are so blurred. Addendum, to clarify, mean blurred to the public. Since we started the Holocron internally, we are well aware what information is G level. We're not even meant to differentiate between G and C level, because that's all the main continuity of Star Wars. That's what that tells me. So we've got that. And then we have specifically, to follow on from the question of how everything is case by case, a specific question is like, and all G level would mean George Lucas himself checks it over, right? G level canon has nothing to do with George Lucas checking it over anything. It's anything that can be taken from the films or internal notes from him that can come into discussions, early drafts, or comments on George Lucas approved text. Early drafts. The novels of the original trilogy are based on early drafts, and they clearly have some inaccuracies. The GCS level canon stuff is a construct specifically for the Holocron. Non-Holocron users would have no idea what this stuff even means. And I would say most people of the people who use the Holocron don't use the field, instead looking specifically to the source of the material. Individual entries are not broken down by canon level. This is how Leland Chi uses it. We need a list of characters from the films, or do a search of characters by G-Canon. We need a list of some planets from the films in the expanded universe, or do a search for planets sorted by canon to determine which ones are going to be recognized by more people. Source A contradicts source B. More likely than not, if source A is from the films and source B is from the EU, we'll use source A. Of course, there can always be exceptions, which is why case-by-case determination is always in effect, no matter what the sources. They're indicators. We are not meant to be applying the canon tiers to anything regarding continuity. Because yes, it's a bit of a guideline, it's a bit of a compass for, okay, more often than not, something will trump the other. But that's not necessarily the case. As we saw earlier, everything is on a case-by-case basis. Yes, there's some guidelines, but at this point, do we even use the canon tier system? And then this one. A clarification is needed if the C and G level are separated, i.e. do they form independent canon, or both part of the overall continuity? There is one overall continuity. Now, I mean, I've said about some of these quotes and things before, in talking about defending the expanded universe. Some of that may feel a little dated now because they're older videos that I did, and I've found some more information as time went on, but this just reinforces the point. There is one overall continuity according to Lucasfilm. The canon tiers are used for is to indicate where it's from, not oh, this is how canon it is. Because everything's case by case. A C-Canon thing could trump T-Canon if it conflicts, and the case by case ruling is that it trumps it. These are all uses of the Holocron from before T-Canon and D-Canon were added. My thing with D-Canon is that Star Wars Detours was never released. There's no point even mentioning it other than for an informative part of this video, because there's no way we can publicly verify any of it. There are some clips on YouTube that have been released since it's been cancelled, but it's not officially released. And so at the end of the day, I don't believe we should be classifying things by canon tiers unless you were to adapt them into a completely different interpretation for just an indicator of the type of source they are. The only important difference to note is non-canon, which are labelled with infinities on all published works. So there's basically Star Wars and there's infinities. You only have to worry about those, generally speaking, although it is good to understand an approach from a release date perspective on when works came out, to understand, oh yeah, old Marvel is a bit wacky and different to how Star Wars became because of how they started taking more note and paying attention to the continuity around 1991 when Heir of the Empire released and Dark Empire came out. It switched to Dark Horse and a lot of things happened here. And now this is my take on it. I've been working on a new version of my timeline reflecting this information because I found it after the last release of my timeline. So I've pared it down to a GCSN. I need to change this description. So in this I'm taking the framework saying, okay, this is about where it's from, and then keeping it just as that. So we've got George Lucas canon, which stays the same. It is the 6 episodic movements and elements originating with George Lucas in the movie novelizations, reference books and other sources. I mentioned that, but basically G-Canon is the movies, the main theatrical movies. Apart from the 2008 Clone Wars movie, because, well, we'll get to that. C-Canon, I call them all the same things. It consists of all works approved by Lucas Licensing after 1991 intended to be part of the main continuity of the expanded universe, as well as anything else that does not have any issues fitting into the continuity. I'm just going to remove that little addendum at the end, because, well, this sentence at the end of it is more me going, Jedi Prince, some of the stuff that's debatable to be part of C-Canon on release date wise, it's a bit of flexibility if I wanted to change it in the timeline. S-Canon, consisting mostly of older works. This canon tier is a place for works that were released before there was a consistent effort to maintain continuity. I'm going to just not give it that flexibility. All of the events in these stories happened, although details told in the stories may not be 100% accurate. Which to me, that gives the best blanket statement for the reason why you can have Shirabri and Lumiere in the old Marvel, going back to that example. And then if later on it's referenced, but they go, some of these are different, some little details are like, okay, yes, it's a bit different because it's a telling of the story that may not be 100% accurate. Or take like Vader trying to ruin the Rebels' credit rating on Moonlinst. There was probably more to that. But for the sake of like, as you read the story, you can go, alright, well, some details might be off, but overall, Vader hunted Rebels on Moonlinst. Type thing. Oh, this is also my headcanon placement of the Clone Wars 2008. I put that in there. I'm turning this into talking about my timeline. And non-canon or what-if stories published under Infinity's label, and anything else never intended as part of the main continuity. In the Clone Wars era, I have completely separated the Clone Wars 2008 entire media. Everyone has their own interpretations of it, and so I've completely removed any canon designation from it and listed everything that's TCW 2008 connected together. That's clearly based off the show with the branding and all of that. Separate to everything else in the Clone Wars. Which I have my designations of C and S and all that. And N, because Tag of Binks there. There's a good example of how it works in one image on my timeline. That's my personal version of taking the canon tier framework and applying it to a timeline for source material. I'm only using them as an indicator on my timeline because I think it needs that for the format. If I didn't think it needed to be there, I could just list everything and it's all Star Wars. And put a little Infinities logo by the ones that are Infinities. That's all I need to do. To reiterate, we've got Star Wars, and then we've got Star Wars Infinities. That's it. The canon tiers were never meant to be used to indicate canonicity of pieces of material. They were only meant to be tags and notation to say where something's from. That's why we've never got, oh, some things could be sorted through, and some of old Marvel could be C-Canon, some of the old stuff could be C-Canon. Because it doesn't matter. That's not what these canon tiers mean. Maybe put it a different way. There's S-level sources, C-level sources, and G-level sources. Because I think when you start calling it, oh, it's this canon, it gets confusing, and people get the wrong interpretation because they go, oh yeah, canon, I understand canon. And then that's not what they actually mean by it. Anyway. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, because this is a big one. And I will see you in the next video. Eerie.